My son told me I was living in his house, that it was just a temporary shelter until he and his wife decided what to do with me. I said nothing, just quietly wiped the dust off a picture frame, his graduation photo, still sitting there in that very house. He didn't know the most important thing. And when he pushed me out the door, thinking he had the right to decide my fate, he forgot to check whose door it truly was. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Margaret Elliott. I was 68 when I moved into my son's house in the suburbs of Seattle. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. I had lived alone for nearly a decade after my husband Harold passed away, and I managed just fine. I kept the bills paid, the lawn trimmed, and the cupboard stocked with everything from oatmeal to canned peaches. I even had a little garden that made the neighbors jealous, especially when the dahlias came in. But then came the falls. First one in the hallway, then another in the backyard while I was trimming the roses. My doctor said it was time to stop pretending I was still 40. My son Joshua told me they had room in their house and hearts. His exact words. I remember because I wrote them down in my planner next to the date of the move. The day I arrived, it was drizzling. That soft Washington rain that doesn't make a sound, but settles into your bones. I climbed out of the cab and stood in front of the two-story house that I had helped them buy 10 years earlier. My pension and savings had covered the down payment when Josh's credit score had been in the gutter. I never asked for anything in return. It felt good back then, to be needed. The porch light was on. Karen, his wife, opened the door. She smiled, not coldly, but not warmly either. A polite kind of smile. I knew that smile well. I'd worn it myself when I had to host people I didn't really want in my home. "Let me show you the guest room," she said. But it wasn't a room. It was the office. A futon had been squeezed between two bookshelves. My boxes, 6 in total, were stacked in a corner like they were waiting to be picked up again. My suitcase sat on the floor unopened. There was no dresser, no closet space cleared out, just a folding table with a lamp. I placed my raincoat on the back of the chair and sat on the edge of the futon. It sagged. I looked around at the framed certificates on the walls. Karen's degree, Josh's realtor license, a motivational quote about ambition. Nothing of mine. That evening, I unpacked only one box, the one with my toiletries, pajamas, and a book of crossword puzzles. The rest I left untouched. Karen told me not to worry about cooking or laundry. "We've got a system," she said, and so I sat, unsure what to do with myself in a house that hummed with someone else's rhythm. At dinner, they served chicken Alfredo from a plastic container. We ate at the kitchen island, not the table. My granddaughter Sarah scrolled on her phone between bites. Josh talked about work. Karen talked about Sarah's dance rehearsals. No one asked me anything. I offered to help with the dishes, but Karen waved me off with a quick shake of her head. "Relax," she said. "This is your time to rest." I smiled. That same polite smile. That night, I lay on the futon, listening to the creaks of a house that no longer felt familiar. I thought of my old home, of the soft, ticking clock in the hallway, the way the afternoon light hit the kitchen tiles, the hum of my neighbor's lawnmower. Here, the air felt thinner, like I had to earn each breath. I didn't cry. I wasn't sad. But something inside me went still, like a pond freezing over. I had come here to feel safe. But instead, I felt like a guest overstaying a welcome that hadn't even been spoken aloud. In the darkness, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would wait. I would watch. I would not shrink. And above all, I would not forget whose name was on the deed. The days took on a quiet routine. I woke early, as I always had, and brewed my coffee before anyone else stirred. The kitchen was mine for just that short window between dawn and the sound of Sarah's alarm clock. I would sit by the window with my mug, watch the clouds drift across the morning sky, and pretend just for a moment that the house was mine again, that Harold was still upstairs shaving, that my own bed was waiting for me down the hall. After Sarah left for school and Josh and Karen drove off to work, the house would grow still, and I would start the small tasks I gave myself, dusting baseboards, organizing the junk drawer, wiping down the refrigerator shelves. No one asked me to do it. No one thanked me either. But it helped me feel like I belonged, even if only to the walls and appliances. I began noticing little things. The way Karen would pause before entering the kitchen when I was there, then choose to leave instead. The way Josh's tone shifted when I asked questions, tight, clipped, as if I had interrupted something important. There were never harsh words, no accusations, but in their absence, a wall began to form, a soft, padded one, the kind that doesn't bruise the skin but muffles your presence until you start to doubt whether you were ever fully there. I started writing notes, not to them, but to myself. Short sentences on the margins of my crossword book, on grocery lists, on the backs of receipts, fragments of thought I couldn't say aloud. It feels colder in the house lately. They spoke around me at dinner. She moved my mug again. I told myself I was being dramatic, but the paper never lied. Karen replaced my hand soap in the bathroom with a brand that smelled like lemon chemicals. She moved my shampoo to the cabinet beneath the sink. I found my cardigan draped over the laundry basket one morning, damp and crumpled, though I had left it folded on the chair. Sarah no longer hugged me as tightly. She barely looked up from her screen. When I tried to join her on the couch, she said, "I'm watching something," without looking in my direction. There were no outbursts, no dramatic scenes, just erasure, one drawer at a time, one routine stripped away. They took over dinner, then my seat at the table, then my role in Sarah's school pickups. They said it was easier if I just relaxed. So I did. I sat more, spoke less, and watched. One evening, I overheard a whisper from the hallway. Karen on the phone, her voice hushed but sharp. "She's always there. I thought she'd be more out of the way." A pause. Then, "Josh says she's fine, but this can't go on forever." I stood in the hallway, holding my breath, holding myself still. My ears burned, my cheeks flushed, not from shame, but from clarity. They didn't see me as part of the family, not even as a guest. I was a delay, a postponed solution, a piece that didn't fit. I walked back to my room. No, not my room. The office. Closed the door gently, sat on the edge of the futon and stared at the shelves filled with books I hadn't read, degrees I hadn't earned, a life that wasn't mine. I reached for the small notebook I kept beside my bed. I opened to a fresh page. "I don't think I'm wanted here." I wrote it slowly, deliberately, as though confessing it would make it real. But the truth was, I had known for a while. Their silence had been speaking to me all along, and I had finally decided to listen. It was a Thursday when I finally went to the garage. The rain had let up for the first time in days, and the house was quiet. Karen had taken Sarah to a dentist appointment, and Josh was still at work. I had the place to myself, or at least as much of it as I was allowed to feel was mine. The garage was colder than I remembered. The floor was bare concrete, and the air smelled faintly of paint thinner and cardboard. My boxes, what was left of my old life, were stacked haphazardly against the far wall. Some had been opened, rummaged through, others were still taped shut, labeled with my old handwriting, kitchen, linens, books. I bent down slowly, knees aching, and pulled a small wooden cabinet forward, one I had once used as a sideboard in the dining room of my own home. Inside, behind a folded tablecloth and a stack of old envelopes, was the folder. It was navy blue, worn at the edges, the corners soft from years of handling. I opened it slowly, the flap still crisp from when I had taped it shut before the move. Inside were the documents most people forget to care about until it's too late. I had never forgotten. There was the mortgage contract dated 12 years ago when Josh and Karen had found this house but couldn't get approved on their own. His credit had been ruined after the business loan failed. They had come to me, not asking for money exactly, but help. I had signed as primary, with my retirement savings providing the down payment. My name was on the deed. My name was on the loan. I had made payments for 4 years until Josh got back on his feet. After that, he promised to take over. I let him. I trusted him. I had never told anyone I kept copies of everything. Signed pages, bank statements, proof of transfers, and letters from the mortgage officer addressed directly to me. I even had a printout of the first email Josh sent thanking me. I stared at the paper, remembering how proud he sounded, how grateful. He had said, "Mom, we couldn't have done this without you." I had felt useful, important. Now I felt something else. I read through the documents again, not because I doubted what I'd find, but to remind myself it was real. I hadn't imagined it. This house wasn't just some vague family asset. It was mine, or at least I had the claim they had conveniently chosen to forget. They treated me like a burden, a guest, an afterthought. But on paper, I was the reason this roof stood over their heads. I took the folder back to my room, the office, and placed it inside the drawer of the nightstand. I sat on the futon, breathing deeply, my hands resting on my knees. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel angry. Not yet. What I felt was awareness, like a fog lifting after too many months of polite pretense. That evening, I noticed Josh looking at his phone with a strange expression. He showed something to Karen, and they exchanged a look. I pretended not to see, but later, when they thought I was asleep, I heard him on the phone in the hallway. His voice was low, but I caught enough. "I know she's here, but she's not really involved. It's temporary. She's not on anything that matters now. Not on anything that matters." I lay still in the dark, the folder now under my pillow. My hand rested on it like a secret. I had been erased from the dinner table, from the decisions, from the rhythm of their lives. But they hadn't erased me from the foundation, the ownership, the history of this place. And now they were going to remember. It started subtly, almost too softly to register. A different tone in Karen's voice when she spoke to me, more measured, almost rehearsed. The way Josh hovered longer in the evenings, asking if I needed anything, offering me extra blankets or different cereal brands, as if I'd been a guest at a hotel whose review mattered. I knew the performance wasn't for my comfort. It was preparation. The first mention came over breakfast. Karen sat down across from me with her tea and said something about how her friend's mother had moved into a retirement community. "She loves it," Karen said, eyes avoiding mine. "They have crafts and lectures and a shuttle that takes them to the store." I nodded. I knew the game. These weren't conversations. These were seeds. A few days later, a pamphlet appeared on the kitchen counter. glossy, pastel-colored, full of staged photos of smiling seniors doing yoga in gardens that didn't really exist. Evergreen meadows, independent living with dignity. I didn't touch it, but I saw Josh glance at it, then glance at me. That evening, he came into the office where I slept. He leaned against the door frame like he used to when he was a teenager and needed to ask for money. He started with nostalgia. Remember how Dad used to joke about retiring by the lake? I did remember, but I said nothing. He kept talking about peace and quiet and my need for community. How it wasn't good for someone my age to just sit around the house. How I deserved more stimulation, more companionship. Then, finally, the offer. There's a great place just 20 minutes from here. Private room, great food, on-site medical care. We could cover part of the cost, and it would give you space to be yourself. As if I wasn't myself here. As if I'd forgotten how to be. I looked at him for a long time, not at the man he had become, but at the boy I remembered, the one who once cried over a scraped knee, the one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, the one I held when his father died. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who spoke in managerial tones, who saw people as problems to be managed, assets to be repositioned. I said I would think about it. The next day, another pamphlet appeared. This one was tucked inside the newspaper. Karen left a post-it note beside it that read, "Just in case you're curious." She had used a smiley face. I kept the pamphlet, not because I was curious, but because I knew what was coming. Later that week, a woman knocked at the door. She introduced herself as a senior care consultant. "Karen scheduled a walkthrough," she said, confused when I met her at the door. "I thought you knew." I invited her in politely, offered her tea, and let her do her little pitch. When she left, I smiled, closed the door gently, and walked back to the office. I opened the drawer and pulled out the folder again, read through every page, not out of doubt, but to feel steady, grounded. That evening, I made tea and sat at the table while Josh scrolled through his phone and Karen reheated leftovers. I told them softly that I appreciated their concern, that I'd thought about the options, that it was kind of them to care so much about my future. Karen looked relieved. Josh relaxed. Then I said, "But I'll be staying here." There was silence, not loud, not explosive, just long, thick. Karen forced a smile. Josh cleared his throat. No one argued, and that told me everything. They weren't going to fight for me to stay, because in their eyes, I'd already overstayed, but I hadn't even begun. I had stared at the mortgage document so many times that its texture had become as familiar to me as the lines in my palms. The paper was soft at the corners, worn down from years of careful folding and unfolding. The ink had lost its original darkness, but there it was, unwavering and clear. Margaret E. Elliott, my full name, centered, legally binding, a name that held weight and history, a name that somehow no one in this house seemed to remember. That document had lived quietly in the bottom drawer of my old roll-top desk for over 20 years. It had survived 2 relocations, a burst pipe in the basement, and one regrettable incident involving Sarah's watercolor project. It was never flashy, never displayed, but it was mine. And when I held it, I didn't just hold proof of ownership, I held proof of identity. When I first moved into Josh and Karen's home, no, into my own home, I had done so thinking it would be temporary, just until I recovered from that minor surgery, just until I regained my footing. But somehow, my presence became permanent while my authority vanished. They hadn't asked me to sign anything. They hadn't consulted me on any changes to the house. They began renovating rooms, rearranging furniture, even locking certain cabinets. I became something between a tenant and an obligation. I kept quiet, partly out of dignity and partly out of hope. Hope that my son would remember, that he'd recall how many jobs I had worked to afford this house when he was still too young to know what a mortgage was, that he'd remember how I stayed up at night reviewing rates, budgeting groceries to cover the next installment, that he'd realize, finally, the floor beneath his feet had been built with my sacrifices. But the quiet wasn't working. It had become a blanket too thin to warm me and too heavy to lift. That morning, I pulled the documents from the desk where I had hidden them again after the last storm of Karen's passive remarks. I laid them all out on the kitchen table, the very table I was now barely invited to sit at. Mortgage contract, payment history, deed, tax assessments, each paper like a breadcrumb, leading back to the truth. I placed them carefully into a fresh manila envelope. On the front in blue ballpoint pen, I wrote just one word: ownership. At dinner, the smell of cheese and pepperoni hung thick in the air. The television played softly in the background. Josh tapped on his phone. Karen scrolled mindlessly, and Sarah half-heartedly pushed olives around her plate. I placed the envelope beside Josh's elbow without a word. My hands didn't tremble. He looked down at it, his eyebrows lifted. He opened the flap, pulled out the contents. He scanned the deed first. His jaw tensed. Then his brow furrowed deeper as he sifted through the rest. Karen leaned in and froze. Her wine glass hovered midair. Sarah sat still, eyes flitting between us. The moment stretched. Josh's hands stopped moving. He stared at the front page of the deed as if it were a foreign language suddenly making sense. He looked at me. There was no anger in his face, just that stunned vacancy of someone who realized he had miscalculated something important. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain what was already spelled out in print. I simply said, with the kind of calm one earns through 1,000 ignored wounds, that I would not be leaving this house. Not now, not ever. That my name had always been there. That I had built this sanctuary long before Karen had set foot in it, and long before Josh had the audacity to pretend otherwise. I reminded him of the down payment, the 4.2% interest rate I had negotiated with grit, the day I had paid off the final installment and cried in my car. I reminded him that while they had used the house, I had loved it, cared for it, protected it, and now I would protect myself. Karen didn't speak. She stood, lifted the plates, and moved like someone escaping a fire without running. Sarah's gaze was glued to the mortgage. She didn't ask questions, but in her silence, I saw something. Curiosity, maybe even respect. Josh finally spoke. He said he hadn't known, that he assumed it had transferred after Dad died, that it was all just paperwork. But I reminded him, paperwork is how power hides in plain sight. I gathered the documents, returned them to the envelope, and stood. My back didn't ache the way it usually did. My hands felt firm. When I walked away, I didn't feel like I was retreating. I felt like I was taking root. And that envelope, it now sat in the drawer beside my bed, not as a shield, not even as proof, but as a symbol. The house bore my name, and so would my future. The house was unusually quiet that morning, cloaked in a kind of charged stillness that made even the ticking of the wall clock sound louder than usual. I woke long before the sun had made its full climb, slipping from my bed as quietly as a whisper. Something inside me had shifted overnight. The silence didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt conclusive. I brewed a pot of coffee in the old drip machine that had traveled with me from 2 homes ago. I poured it into my favorite mug, the one with the faded roses and the small chip in the rim that my husband had once called a smile. I sat at the kitchen table, the one that used to host breakfast conversations and Sunday puzzles, and looked out at the backyard where the maple leaves had started to fall. It was time. The envelope I had handed Josh 2 nights ago was no longer in the drawer where I had returned it after he read it. I didn't know if he kept it or if it had ended up in the trash, but it didn't matter. The knowledge inside it had been released. It had done its work. Josh hadn't looked me in the eyes since that night. He walked through the house like a stranger, unsure of his welcome. Karen had taken the opposite approach, overly polite, painfully formal, asking if I needed anything with the brittle smile of someone watching a fuse burn down. Even Sarah had started acting different, quieter, almost wary, like she sensed something foundational was tilting beneath our feet. After breakfast, I took a slow walk through the house. My house. I ran my fingers along the banister I had repainted myself a decade earlier. I checked the pantry I had once reorganized during flu season. I stepped into the laundry room, remembering how many nights I had folded towels there while listening to the hum of old radio dramas. Every inch of this place carried the fingerprints of my labor. Then I went to the garage. The moving boxes were there, stacked neatly from my last relocation. Each one still bore black marker labels in my own handwriting: books, linens, winter coats, keepsakes. I loaded them onto a dolly one by one, the sound of cardboard brushing concrete oddly comforting. Inside, I began packing, not as an act of surrender, but as a declaration. The sweaters I had knitted myself, the framed photo of Harold and me on our 30th anniversary, the cookbook with pages stuck together from use. I wrapped each object in layers of newspaper and care. These weren't just things. They were proof of presence, of memory, of mattering. Around midday, the front door opened. Josh's car had returned. I heard his steps before I saw him. He paused at the threshold of the room where I was packing. His eyes scanned the growing stack of boxes. He didn't speak right away. When he finally did, his voice sounded smaller than I remembered. "What are you doing?" I didn't respond with an explanation. I simply said, "Making space." He didn't know what to do with that. "Where will you go?" he asked. I told him I wasn't sure. Maybe a cottage by the lake, maybe a quiet apartment with a balcony and good sun, maybe somewhere new. But wherever it would be mine. And I would walk through its door knowing that I chose it, that no one could say I didn't belong. He looked away. I could tell he wanted to argue, to defend something, but he didn't. Maybe he knew it would ring hollow. Maybe he saw that this wasn't about punishment. This was about peace. Karen never came downstairs. I suspected she was behind the bedroom door, listening to every sound, waiting for confirmation that the crisis was resolving itself without confrontation. Sarah sat on the stairs, not saying a word. Her wide eyes followed me as I carried a small lamp wrapped in towels to the car I had rented that morning. I hadn't asked for help. I didn't need any. I had hired a mover, a young man named Ethan, who arrived right on time, handled every item with care, and didn't ask questions. He moved with the respectful quiet of someone who understood the importance of transitions. When the last box was loaded, I stood in the doorway and looked at the house one final time. It looked exactly the same, but something essential had changed. Not in the paint, or the furniture, or the structure. In me. I had arrived here carrying history. Now I was leaving with clarity. Josh stood near the dining room archway. His mouth opened, then closed again. I gave him a small nod. No lecture, no plea, just a goodbye that didn't need to be spoken aloud. I turned and walked toward the car. The air outside was sharp and clean, like it had been scrubbed of everything stale. I climbed into the passenger seat, and as Ethan shut the door, I felt something inside me settle. The house wasn't the loss. Losing myself had been. And now, piece by piece, I was reclaiming who I had always been, before silence, before compromise, before being made to feel like a burden. The departure wasn't the end. It was the beginning, and I was finally ready to start. The envelope came 2 weeks after I left the house, the same house that had held decades of my labor, love, and silence. It arrived in a bundle of mail forwarded by the post office, glossy catalogs I never asked for, a charity appeal, a coupon flyer for a grocery store I'd never step foot in again. But this envelope was different, thicker, heavier, its seal stamped in blue ink. No return address, just a formal typeface printed in the corner. The name of the mortgage bank. I knew before opening it. Some things you feel in your bones. I waited until the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the porch of my rental cottage in North Carolina. The sea air drifted through the screen door, and the only sound was the rhythmic hush of waves. This was my chosen quiet, not the stifling hush of being ignored, but the serene silence of being enough. I carried the envelope to the table, poured myself a fresh cup of chamomile, and opened it with the tip of a butter knife. No rush. I had waited long enough. Inside was a formal letter addressed to me, not as Mom, not as Margaret, but as the primary mortgage holder. The words were cold and efficient, a string of clauses designed to protect legal boundaries. They read, a request had been submitted to refinance the mortgage. That request had been denied because the primary signer had not authorized it, because the legal owner of record had not given consent, because in every legal sense that mattered, I still held the keys. There it was, in black and white, my name alone at the center of the title, unchanged, untouched, unyielding. They had tried to erase me again, Josh and Karen, likely scrambling to find ways to gain control after I left. Perhaps they thought my departure meant surrender. Perhaps they assumed that my absence meant they could rewrite ownership, that paper was as disposable as my presence had seemed to them. But paper remembers. As I read, I imagined them sitting across from some bank official, forced to explain why the document lacked the essential signature, watching their confidence falter, listening to someone explain what they should have known from the start, that legality cannot be replaced with assumption, and ownership cannot be inherited through arrogance. My hands trembled only once as I turned the second page and saw a copy of the original mortgage form attached, the same one I had signed 24 years ago. My signature, steady and strong. Margaret E. Elliott. I placed the pages down and leaned back in my chair, letting the moment wash over me. It wasn't triumph, not entirely. It was something deeper, a quiet vindication, proof that I hadn't invented my significance, that all the years of holding things together hadn't been invisible, that, legally and spiritually, I was still the foundation. Later that evening, I received an email. The subject line was blank. The sender, Josh Elliott. I opened it slowly. The message inside was short and hesitating. There was a mix-up with the refinance. The bank said something about a missing signature. Maybe we can meet and talk. Just want to clear things up. No pressure. Hope you're doing okay. There was no apology, No acknowledgement of everything he had said before. No mention of how I had been treated. Just a cold transaction framed as a family check-in. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked down to the shoreline. The sand was cool under my feet. The wind tangled in my hair. I thought about the letter, about how many years I had spent minimizing myself so others could feel taller, about the birthdays forgotten, the dinners skipped, the moments dismissed. I thought about all the times I had folded my worth into silence, and how the bank, cold and impersonal, had spoken louder on my behalf than my own family. I returned home and placed the letter in the top drawer of my nightstand, not out of spite, out of self-recognition. I was not a footnote. I was the author. Ownership isn't about who stands in the room loudest. It's about whose name stays on the page when the noise fades. And mine was still there, as clear as ever. Let them learn to live with that. I wrote the address by hand, not on a lease or a form or a delivery slip. I wrote it in the center of a fresh page of my journal, with deliberate strokes, as if to prove to the paper and myself that it was real. This was not a temporary stop, not a borrowed corner in someone else's home. This was my beginning, my anchor, my proof. The cottage was modest but full of warmth, nestled just outside a sleepy town on the Carolina coast, where the wind smelled faintly of salt and pine. The paint on the shutters was flaking, and the wooden steps creaked under the slightest weight, but I found comfort in every imperfection. The flaws didn't make it broken, they made it mine. Each morning, I opened the windows to let the sea air sweep through the rooms. The curtains danced gently, like they were celebrating freedom with me. I spent the first week arranging everything with a care I hadn't known in years. I placed my late husband's navy blue sweater on the back of a chair. I polished the copper kettle that once whistled in our old family kitchen. I framed an old photograph of me holding Josh as a newborn. His tiny fists curled, his face still red from birth. I placed it on the bookshelf, next to my favorite novels and a candle that smelled like cinnamon. There was something healing in the way I filled the silence, not with noise, but with intention. I played classical music in the evenings. I scribbled observations in the margins of library books. I baked scones with blueberries from the farmer's market and filled the rooms with scent and softness. Every day, the space grew warmer, as if it were recognizing me. Then came the letter, a thin envelope forwarded from my old address, bearing the sterile logo of a mortgage institution. Inside, a terse statement, delinquent payments, a flag for reassessment, a reminder that legal responsibilities must be met. My name was still there, tethered to a property I had walked away from, both physically and emotionally. I held the letter for a long time, not because I was tempted to intervene, but because I wanted to feel the weight of what I had left behind. I imagined Josh opening his own copy, reading the words that wouldn't budge no matter how hard he wished them away. He had thought that pushing me out would give him control. He never understood that ownership doesn't transfer through disrespect. It stays with the one who built the foundation. A day later, a second envelope arrived. This one smaller, brighter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Sarah's. Inside, a folded piece of pink paper, decorated with stars. Her note was brief but full of heart. I miss you, Grandma. I keep telling Mom I want to visit. She says we're busy, but I don't think that's true. I hope you're happy where you are. I still remember how your cocoa tastes. I reread her words until the ink seemed to imprint into my fingertips. Then I wrote her back, choosing my words with the softness she deserved. I told her the door was always open, the porch light always on. I promised the cocoa would be just as she remembered it. I didn't send the letter right away. I kept it for a few days, placing it on the windowsill where the morning light would touch it. It felt symbolic somehow, like keeping the door open without stepping outside to beg. Time passed. I joined a watercolor class at the community center. I met a retired nurse who taught me how to prune hydrangeas. I learned the names of birds by the sounds of their calls. These weren't just hobbies, they were quiet testaments. I was still learning, still growing, still choosing. Then something happened I hadn't expected. I met someone. His name was Thomas, a widower with a soft voice and a habit of quoting poetry at inappropriate moments. We kept bumping into each other at the local library and eventually started sharing walks along the shoreline. At first, I thought it was just friendship, but over time, our talks grew longer, our silences more comfortable. One afternoon, we sat on my porch sipping tea, watching the storm roll in. The wind picked up, and I felt a thrill, not fear, but life stirring. He looked at me with a quiet smile and said, "Margaret, you make solitude look so graceful. I almost envy it. But would you ever consider sharing that peace with someone again?" I didn't answer right away. But later that night, I found myself brushing my hair with a care I hadn't felt in years, wondering what it might be like to grow old beside someone new, not because I needed him, but because I wanted him. That distinction meant everything. Weeks turned into months. Our companionship grew steady, gentle. We attended local events together. He brought me lemons from his tree. I shared the blueberry scones I had perfected. One evening, over dinner, he reached across the table and took my hand. "You know," he said, "this feels like home. Not the place, the person." I never thought I'd consider marriage again. But love, I've learned, doesn't come with an expiration date. It just changes its shape, slower, quieter, but just as real. So now, in this little cottage by the sea, I'm planning a wedding. A simple one. A second chance. I'll wear a soft blue dress. We'll serve lemon bars and tea in the backyard. Sarah will be the flower girl if she's allowed to come, and if not, I'll save her a slice of cake and write her name in the guest book. This house was not just shelter. It was sanctuary, a place where I didn't have to defend my worth or prove my usefulness. Here, I was not a burden. I was the foundation, the light, the decision maker. I had a new address, and soon I would share it. On my own terms, with joy, with choice. Because even now, even in this chapter of silver hair and quiet nights, I am still building, still dreaming, still beginning.